Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. Today, we'll hear from guest experts from the NC State Climate Office, Allison Whitaker and Corey Davis, who will present on growing season scenarios in North Carolina. Allison and Corey are going to highlight the role that climate plays in various growing season scenarios. And that's a topic that is really top of mind for many of us, not only as gardening educators, but also as gardeners. After the presentation, Matt Bertone and Mike Munster of the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic are going to address our BOLOs, and those are the plant diseases and pests to be on the lookout for this month. We're also going to hear from Charlotte Glen, the program manager for our statewide Extension Master Gardener program, who will present Plant These for Pollinators on Serviceberry this month. And we'll also hear some statewide program announcements. Before we get started, we hope to get you excited for tomorrow, NC State's Day of Giving. For 24 hours, you can make a powerful difference for the NC State Extension Master Gardener program. Thanks to two generous donors, we do have $15,000 in challenge gifts waiting to be unlocked. And the first challenge is when we receive 60 gifts to the EMG program fund, an anonymous donor will contribute an additional $5,000 to support statewide programming. Those funds are available immediately for program use. So your donation of any size, anytime tomorrow will count toward our 60 gifts goal. Secondly, when we raise $5,000, another anonymous donor will give $10K to the EMG endowment. And that, of course, grows our permanent long-term funding for our program. And your gift tomorrow does also count toward this $5,000 goal. So how do you make a gift of any size? Please use this link tomorrow, the link that you see here. I'll read it out loud. go.ncsu.edu/DOG-master-gardener. Whether you give a gift or not, we are still so grateful for your contributions to our program. In celebration of Day of Giving and how it supports our vital volunteer service and our extension outreach, we're having the popular Dr. Dan Potter speak again, this time on trees for bees. So if you haven't yet, please register on the NC EMG intranet for the webinar Zoom link. It's happening tomorrow at 1 p.m. And whether you attend this webinar or not, the recording and the resource document will be posted on the continuing ed part of our intranet, and they will also be emailed out to all EMG volunteers and extension agents. So now we're going to hear from today's presenters about Allison Whitaker in her role as Extension Associate for the NC State Climate Office. Allison champions climate awareness and resilience to ensure a safer future for North Carolinians. Since 2024, Allison has co-led the statewide Planning for Extreme Heat cohort. Allison also uses creative tools like games and simulations to help people understand climate science. Corey Davis is the Assistant State Climatologist at the NC State Climate Office. Corey also serves as the editor for the Climate blog, as well as the co-creator of monitoring and visualization tools, including Cardinal, the Fire Weather Intelligence Portal, and the Air Quality Portal. Corey currently represents the State Climate Office on the NC Drought Management Advisory Council. So welcome, Allison and Corey.
All right, thanks, Ariyah. Allison, whenever you can see the slides up, feel free to take it away with our first few slides here.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this warm welcome. We're so excited to be here today. We're going to give you a brief overview of an update of kind of what we've seen so far over the winter, and then an outlook of what could be to come. So let's get started. I think you already know the drill here, but just keep yourself on mute as we present. And if you want, you can turn your video off. You're also welcome to leave it on if you like. We have about 40 minutes of presentation, and then we'll be happy to take some questions at the end. But if questions come up during our presentation, please drop them in the chat. We would love to see them as they come through. And if you do social media, here's where we are. We would love for you to follow us and keep up to date on everything that we share. So, the State Climate Office, let me tell you a little bit about what we are, what we do. So, we're based at NC State on the Centennial campus, and we're a public service center for all of North Carolina. We have 11 full-time staff, and we operate the North Carolina EcoNet, which is what you see in this photo. And it consists of 45 research-grade weather stations, many of which are located in agricultural research farms across the state. So let's do a quick review of winter before we get into the details. All right, so using the chat, I want you to tell us what your most memorable part of this winter was. Now, we've thrown in some highlights here. I think the one that, probably is top of mind for most folks is that ice and snowstorm that we had in January. But we also had really unseasonably warm weather around Christmas, and then we got an early February bloom. So I'm seeing snow, freeze. Yeah, those two winter storms back to back, waiting for the snow. Charlotte, you must be in Raleigh. Wow, someone said they could grow tomatoes and peppers until December. What about you, Corey? What stood out for you this winter?
For me, it was how long that snow stuck around. From that first kind of sleet and ice storm we had, it was probably 3 weeks before that snow finally went away. And I can't remember a winter like that where we've had snow on the ground for that long in probably 25 years. So that was the really impressive part of the season for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I see 10 inches of snow in Brunswick. Wow. Snow in Wilmington, too.
Yeah, we'll highlight some of those areas in just a minute, but that was another impressive part. The amount of snow that we saw, especially in eastern North Carolina, places that aren't used to getting 8 to 10 inches in any season.
Absolutely. I see the bulbs have come up early. Yeah, I've got tulips that are trying to push up at the moment as well, and I'm like, I'm not ready yet. Right. It looks like snow is probably the leading thing that stood out for most people.
Yeah, and we're not surprised by that, but I am glad that folks mentioned being able to grow things later in the season, going into the winter, and also being able to start planting a little bit earlier because I think that snow we had really only happened over the span of about 1 week. So we did have a lot more to winter than just those couple of frozen events. And we'll talk about some of that as we go along here. One way that we can highlight some of the variability that we saw over this past winter is by looking at our daily temperatures. So this is a busy plot. There's a lot to take in here, but the blue bars you're seeing, those are the individual days during this past winter from December through February, and that highlights the range between the daily high and low temperature. In the background, you see this sort of brown curvy line that goes through the middle. That's the typical daily temperature range. And then when you get above normal, that's when you get into the red area at the top. Below normal is the blue area at the bottom. So we can see from this that we started off the winter pretty cold. We had some below normal temperatures for the first couple weeks of December, and then we got in that really warm stretch around Christmas. Places like Charlotte had new daily record high temperatures in the upper 70s on Christmas days. So very unseasonably warm through that part of the season. We had more warmth in that first week or two of January, and then by the middle of the month, it turned cold. And of course, that's where we saw that snow and ice over those last couple weeks of January in parts of eastern North Carolina that had that blanket of snow on the ground. We had some extreme cold temperatures in early February, down in the single digits, which again is very rare for that part of the state. And then, sure enough, by the middle of February, all the snow was gone and we started to warm up again. And we had some more unseasonably warm weather, some 70s, even some spots had 80-degree days by the end of the month. So, again, some big ups and downs with our temperatures over the past winter. So, even though folks will remember that cold and the snow, it was not cold and snowy through the entire season. So, that's your main takeaway from this slide. Now, as we go through the webinar this morning and we highlight some of the different features of our weather over the past season and the coming seasons, we also wanted to highlight the role that climate change is playing in our weather. And I want to give this group credit because back in 2018, right after Hurricane Florence, we gave a presentation on one of these Plants, Pests, and Pathogens webinars. In that case, there were lots of questions about the future of extreme events like extreme rainfall and hurricanes. And this group was very interested. They were curious. And we didn't let any of the politics that sometimes accompanies climate change creep into that discussion. We stuck to the science and the data. So that's our goal again this morning. So again, thanks for always being supportive of this type of information and for your curiosity about it. So when we think about our temperatures in the wintertime, I have called this the canary in the coal mine. This was really the first sign that things were starting to change in North Carolina because we noticed around the turn of the century that our winters were generally a lot warmer than they used to be. And you can see that pretty well on this graph here, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. We have had some extremely warm winters. The way I like to describe this is if you take any of these recent years, kind of superimpose it over what happened historically, in this case back in the 70s or early 80s, those years would just look out of place because of how warm they were. And in fact, we can see what that trend has looked like over time. Our winter average temperatures have warmed by about a degree per decade over the last 50 years. So even though this winter was fairly cold by recent standards, it was actually pretty close to the historical average. So again, that shows how things have shifted and warmed as we've gone through time. Let's talk about the snow because that's what folks really seem to remember about this season. I think there's a few really impressive things about this map that shows the total snowfall over the past season. Of course, most of this snow came from that one event in late January and early February. But as we know in North Carolina, sometimes it only takes one good snow event to really make the entire season. So we saw across parts of the Piedmont, from Charlotte up through Greensboro, there was more than a foot of snow in total, again, mostly from that one event. Out in the western part of the state, especially in some of our higher elevation areas, we also had more than 12 inches in total. And then some of those coastal areas. These are spots that only average maybe 2 to 4 inches of snow per year. They ended up with more than a foot because of that one storm. So some really impressive amounts that we hadn't seen in many years. And of course, we don't want to forget about the folks in the Raleigh area. Unfortunately, they mostly missed out on that late January storm. They pretty much had to wait all day before any snow finally filled in the gap between the western Piedmont and the coast. So they ended up with below normal snow for the season. Raleigh averages about 5 inches per year. It only had about 4 inches this year. So again, definitely feel for the folks in the triangle. Hopefully in the next few years, we'll see another decent snow and you guys can get in on the fun that the rest of us had. One way that we like to look at the recency of snow events is by looking at the last time we had at least 6 inches of snow. So going into the winter, here's what that picture looked like across the state. We did have parts of eastern North Carolina right along the coastline that had seen a decent 6 to 8 inch snow last winter in 2025. And then also parts of the mountains, especially in those higher elevation areas, had some more recent snow. For most of the mountains, though, we had to go back to January of 2022 to find the last 6 inch event. And then across the Piedmont, it was anywhere from 2018 in the north, 2014 in the southwest, 2010 in the southeast, since we had seen a good 6 inch snow. And then I know we heard earlier from folks in Wilmington and Brunswick County, they had to go back to 1989, right before Christmas, since they had last seen 6 inches of snow on the ground. So as a result of the snow that we saw this winter, here's what that updated map looks like. You see this widespread blue color across the state? That was really like throwing a blanket of snow over most of North Carolina. So most areas have now seen a 6 inch snow just this past winter. And again, looking at parts of the eastern Piedmont, including the Raleigh area, that's where they really missed out. So still northern Wake County has to go back to 2018 for their last 6 inch snow. Southern Wake County and then getting down into Johnston and Sampson counties have to go back to 2010 to their last 6 inch snow event. So again, we know those areas didn't see quite as much this year, but most of the state did see some really solid snow over this past winter. We also wanted to acknowledge changes that have happened in our snowfall patterns over the last 30 years or so. And I think for folks that have lived in North Carolina for a while, this has become pretty obvious. We just don't get the frequency and amount of snow that we used to, say, back in the 70s and 80s, and even through the mid 90s. One way of looking at that is through the 30-year moving average snowfall. So basically, that's taking any given year, like I'll pick 1989 for this example, because that's when Charlotte had its highest level, almost 8 inches. This is averaging the annual snow between 1960 and 1989 over that 30-year period. And then as we've gone through the time into the 21st century, we've been averaging mostly recent years in this mix since 2000. So again, here's what it looks like for Charlotte. At one point in the late 80s, they were averaging almost 8 inches of snow per year. Now, as a result of some pretty lackluster years, they're down to less than 4 inches on average. Of course, this year was not one of those snow-free years. They had more than a foot in total over this past winter. So you might wonder how that affects this 30-year average. Well, here's the answer. I'm going to flip the slide and you will see the change. That's it. I'll flip back and forth just in case you missed it, but one good year does not suddenly offset more than a decade of pretty low snow totals in the Charlotte area. They still average less than 4 inches per year over those past 30 years. And when we think about what's happened, especially over the last 5 years or so, they have had several years with zero total snowfall. So again, one year does not make up for the trend that we've noticed lately all across the state, which is that our snowfall is decreasing on average. So next, we're going to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that we also watched this winter was an ongoing drought. It started developing last fall. It's continued through the winter and now into the start of spring. So I'll hand things back over to Allison to guide us through another observation question.
All right. So in the chat, we want to hear what drought impacts you have noticed. This could be in your garden. It could be on drives around town. And what you see on your screen is August through our most recent drought monitor, kind of a rolling visual there, so you can see how that drought has deepened. So how have you noticed those drought impacts? Corey, is anything standing out to you?
You know, when I did our introductions earlier, she mentioned my role in representing the climate office on the North Carolina Drought Council. We do hear impacts from citizens, from various sectors, including agriculture. And over the winter, there weren't a lot of impacts to be seen. We saw some of the deeper moisture reserves that were lacking a little bit, but during that cool season, we really don't tend to see as many impacts. So I'm curious if our astute gardeners out there have noticed some things over these past few months.
Oh yeah, I'm seeing some great observations come in. So cracks in the soil, leaves dropping from deciduous trees earlier than normal, extremes, too much rain, too little rain, dry grass, icky streams. I like that description.
Yeah, I'd say that captures a lot of what we've heard as a drought council, and also I think a lot of what people have noticed in their garden, in their neighborhoods, in their communities. In some cases, you have to look pretty hard to find them, but if you look close enough, you can see where things have been pretty dry. Anything else, Allison, from the chat?
Some folks are saying their water bills are higher than normal.
Interesting.
And I'm also seeing stress on fruit trees, and they're going into flowering season now. So that's a big thing to note.
Yeah, that is a good observation. So let's keep talking then about drought, how we got into this situation and when we might finally get out of it. So we saw this drought originate late last summer and early in the fall. If you remember, we had a mostly wet summer last year, but a lot of that rain really ended by the middle of August. So then we got into this extended dry spell where we struggled to get decent rain every week. One contributing factor was that we really didn't see much tropical activity later in the season, in the summer, early in the fall. We do rely on tropical systems to bring a decent dose of our rain at that time of the year. So when we miss out on those storms, we can see droughts emerge. So that's what happened last year. Between the beginning of September and the end of October, we started seeing pockets of moderate and severe drought, especially across the eastern part of the state, and there were impacts that supported that. For one, we saw places like Snow Hill went more than 40 days with less than a quarter inch of rain in total. We'll talk a little bit later about flash drought, but this was a great example of that, suddenly shifting into one of these dry stretches where we just didn't see much of any rain. We also saw down in Johnston County that a lot of the later planted crops last year, like cotton and soybeans, really didn't have enough moisture late in the season. They were turning brown, they were wilting. Now, fortunately, we had enough rain during the heart of the growing season last summer that most crops like corn fared pretty well. But again, some of those crops that need a little bit more moisture right toward the end of the season, and they really never got it last fall. And then one thing we always watch for when we're in droughts, especially in the spring and in the fall, is wildfire activity. Fortunately, it was not a super busy fire season last fall, but we did have some big events, including up in the mountains. There was a 160-acre fire up near Banner Elk. So again, another sign of that drought that was developing throughout the season. And then as we went through the winter, unfortunately, things really never got any better. Now, we typically think of winter as a season of recovery when it comes to drought. That's because there is not as much water demand. Folks are not watering their lawns. Farmers are not irrigating their crops. People aren't washing cars at that time of the year, so we're not pulling as much water from our supplies. And also because of the cooler temperatures, evaporation rates are lower at that time of the year. So we like to say that a little bit of rain goes a long way during our winter season, but unfortunately, we only ever really had a little bit of rain plus the melted snowfall over the winter season. And we actually saw drought get worse, where we now have widespread severe drought and even some pockets of extreme drought across North Carolina. In terms of the impacts, one is just how dry the winter was. It was one of our top 10 driest winters on record statewide. And in places like Marion, it was one of the top 5 driest on record. As all across the state, we started seeing that some of those winter crops like pastures, hay fields were really struggling. More than half of the pastures across the state were rated in poor to very poor condition by USDA, and they just never saw the moisture that they needed to see that recovery. And also all across the state, we saw those low stream levels. Someone mentioned earlier how some of those creeks and streams have really reduced to a trickle. We have had some better recent rainfall, but it hasn't been enough to fully alleviate those problems with our surface water conditions. So that's another impact that we watch closely to tell us how drought is progressing or recovering. So how long will this drought last? Well, we can look at least to history to see how long these winter droughts have gone on. One thing that may be surprising is that this is the 5th year in a row that we had drought in place in parts of North Carolina going into the wintertime. So we can see from these other 4 years recently, in a couple cases, that drought was actually over before we ended the winter season. These were less severe droughts, but also we got enough moisture during the wintertime that it really reduced those impacts before we started the spring. In other cases, like last winter and then back in 2022, it took until we got into the summer before we had fully eroded all of those drought conditions. Those were a little more severe going into the season, so it took a little bit longer and a little bit more rain in the spring before we finally got rid of those. And then we can see a couple other examples back in 2017 and 2013 where those droughts finally ended sometime during the spring. So I think those are the better case scenarios. The worst case scenarios is what happened back in 2011, in 2008, and 2002. These were much longer lasting droughts, in some cases that lasted for more than a year. And you see these really made it into the start of the next winter, if not the next spring, before we fully got rid of them. So yeah, if you ask me my educated guess about when this drought will end, I think obviously we're past the ability to end it by February since we're now in March. I think because we do still have that severe and even extreme drought in place, it's going to take several months of decent rain to fully get rid of that. So it's probably optimistic to be out of drought by May. I think maybe June to August, that time frame that we've seen last year and in 2022, is more realistic. And there are reasons to believe, as we'll show in a minute, that we may get some better precipitation over that time frame. So what does that mean for your planting now? We know we're in drought. We know that it's probably not going to totally go away between now and the time you plant. Obviously, we'll watch the soil moisture very closely. Now, because of that rain we've had over the last month, that's at least been able to saturate the top layers of the soil. So you may even notice some of those squishy spots in your yard where it's gotten pretty wet. But the caution is that's only the top layer of soil. Beneath that, especially if you go maybe 6 to 12 inches down, things can still be pretty dry. And you can see in this map on the left, this is what we call a column integrated soil moisture. This goes down about 2 meters or 6 feet deep. And this really highlights the level of dryness that we've got, especially across the central part of the state and then into parts of the coastal plain. The soils there are still mostly drier than normal for this time of the year. So what that means is if plants are starting to take root now, those roots are likely to stay in those very upper levels where there is moisture in the topsoil. The concern then is that if they don't develop this nice deep root system, if we get into more dry weather later this summer, then they can really just shrivel up once that topsoil moisture starts to evaporate. So that's the concern. Again, planting when we're in a drought, but especially after we've had some recent rainfall, is just how deep will those roots develop from any new plants. So in terms of where we're at now, we can look at some of the ag impacts that we've seen just over the last month. These come to us from the county extension agents with North Carolina Cooperative Extension, and also from volunteer precipitation observers in the CoCoRaHS network. This is a citizen science program that provides really valuable precipitation data and also impact reports, like we'll see on this slide. So we started hearing some of these impacts coming out of the winter late in February. Down in southeastern North Carolina in Robeson County, they were telling us that after the rain we had, the topsoil moisture levels had recovered, but again, those subsoil, the deeper soil layers were still fairly dry, so they needed more rain to really recharge the full depth of the soil. In the western part of the state, by the beginning of March, they had started to see some warm weather by then, and it was having an impact. It was drying up the ground, but at the same time, that warmth meant that spring was ongoing. So their bushes and trees, like the redbuds and the magnolias, were already in bloom for the season. And of course, that's continued even more, and that's brought a lot more pollen over these last couple weeks. By the middle of March, through that point, it had been a very dry start to the month, less than half an inch of rain in total in places like Rowan County. So they were noticing that the farm ponds had been down. That's another area where typically decent rainfall during the wintertime will help those farm ponds recover, but we just missed out on a lot of that moisture this season, and we never saw that recharge that we were hoping for. And then finally, just last week up in the Northeast in Chowan County, we heard that their winter wheat crop had actually fared fairly well. Even though it had been dry during the winter, they had some decent rains to start the spring, but at the same time, they weren't seeing any standing water, and they knew going into a dry week like we've had over these last 7 days, that would be a concern because it meant there was just no moisture in reserve for some of those crops that probably need a little bit more to end the growing season. So now let's shift over to talking about the weather outlook for the next few months. And again, Allison, I'll hand back to you to guide us through this next pretty fun question.
All right, so when Corey and I were thinking about outlooks, we thought about the groundhog. And so the question I have for you is, do you prefer a long winter or an early spring? And can we do better than the groundhog? So this is Snurd. This is our resident groundhog from Garner, North Carolina, who's taken over for Sir Walter Raleigh as he has retired. So check out Snurd. He's kind of cute. See? Okay, so Corey and I took a guess yesterday when we were talking through this, and we said it's gonna be early spring for these folks, and that looks like the winter. Although I'm seeing a good number of long winters here as well, so maybe 50-50. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder,
I'm surprised.
is it Charlotte and the Raleigh area folks that really want a little bit of snow, so they want that extra winter time this year?
I just don't want it to be 90 degrees
Yeah,
in March.
I'm with you there.
Yep, that's totally fair. Okay, so a good mix I'm seeing. So what's in store for us, Corey?
Yeah, so let's talk about the groundhog. So I'll start off by saying that we've done some research at our office in the past and found that the groundhog predictions are only about as accurate as a coin flip. And that makes sense because it's just trying to tell us, will it stay colder or will it turn warmer? But there was an interesting, at least coincidence that we noticed this year. So several groundhogs in this part of the country were all on the same page. So we saw Snurd down in Garner, who saw his shadow. He predicted the long winter. Punxsutawney Phil also predicted a long winter this year. And at that same time, there was also agreement with our weather outlooks. So at the very end of January, the Climate Prediction Center put out this monthly outlook for February, and they were also showing below normal temperatures were likely, really all the way from Pennsylvania in Phil's territory down through the Carolinas. So that made us think maybe these groundhogs are onto something. Maybe they're really in touch with the weather and they're aware of something that the outlooks are picking up, that this winter weather will last a little bit longer. What happened a couple weeks later, though, was pretty interesting because the weather outlooks took a really sudden, abrupt turn. They went from showing that cold weather through the end of the month to a much warmer pattern through the middle of March. And you can see that was across most of the country, from Texas all the way up to the Northeast. These above normal temperatures were likely. So what actually happened during that time? Well, it was a little bit of both. We did start February on that cold note, but really by mid to late February, it had warmed up. We've seen a few cooler days mixed in here and there, but for the most part, it has stayed warm over those 6 weeks since Groundhog Day. So I think in this case, we can give the groundhogs a pass for one important reason, and that's that they don't get a chance to revise their forecast. They get one shot at it on February 2nd, and as human weather forecasters, we reserve the right to come back a week or two later and say, actually, we think it's going to do this instead. So again, I won't give the groundhogs too hard of a time after that. So now that we're officially in the spring season, it's both the climatological spring and now astronomical spring, which began on the equinox last week. We can start thinking about when that last spring freeze will occur for the season. So on our office's website, we have a freeze date explorer tool. You can see the link down here if you want to go check it out for yourself. But this shows historically when that average last spring date has occurred all across the state. So lots of colored dots on here, lots of different ranges to look at. I thought I'd try to simplify this just a little bit for you. So right along the coastline, we are now past time for that average last spring freeze. These areas tend to see their last freeze sometime between early to say the third week of March. It's obviously not out of the question. You could see some cooler temperatures later in the season, but historically, you were pretty much out of the woods for a freeze. So in those areas, you can pretty safely say that you're now in the spring season. A little further inland, especially right along that I-95 corridor, you're pretty much in the any day now range. So these areas tend to see their last spring freeze in the last week of March. Again, it's not unheard of to see a later freeze than that, maybe in early April, but just looking at the weather forecast right now, there are no big freeze threats over the next week or so. So I think these areas are probably also pretty safe in terms of not seeing any more freezes. Across most of the Piedmont, I would say we are probably at least a week or two away. Again, maybe we've already seen our last freeze for the season, but we can't always count on that. Typically, these areas see their last freeze sometime in the first couple weeks of April. I know someone earlier out in Davie County mentioned it was a chilly day there today. It looks like maybe later this weekend, like Sunday morning, there is at least a chance of a scattered frost. So again, that's why we encourage folks to wait, even when it's been as warm as it has, to early to mid-April before planting in this area, because you can see those later freezes. And then for the western part of the state, you're probably at least a month away from being out of the woods for a freeze. Places like Asheville tend to see their last freeze sometime in mid-April. Obviously, higher elevation areas will wait a little bit longer than that. So that's kind of the picture and where we stand right now in terms of freezes across the state. We can also look at a format like this with a table to see how that looks. Again, in the spring, we typically see that last freeze happen further east earlier and then further west later over the span of about a month between Wilmington and Asheville. The same thing happens in reverse in the fall. Asheville, those western areas, will see the first fall freeze. Wilmington and those eastern areas will see the last fall freeze about a month later. And then we can also look at how long the growing season tends to be. So a little less than 200 days on average in the western part of the state, closer to 250 days in parts of eastern North Carolina. So here's where we can also bring in that change over time. These numbers are all based on the historic 20th century averages, but we can also see where things stand so far in the 21st century. So you see most areas are seeing that last spring freeze happen about a week earlier or so on average, and then that first fall freeze is happening about a week later on average. One place where we don't see as big of a change is right along the coast, places like Wilmington and Hatteras. They have not seen as much of a change over time. I would speculate a big reason for that is because they are already very close to these bodies of warm, almost tropical water, so that really hasn't affected their climate as much at this time of the year. Inland areas may see some warmer air masses move in sooner, coming out of the wintertime, but the coastal areas are already pretty close to those warm air masses anyway. So I think that's probably why you don't see those big changes further east. But in terms of what that means for the growing season length, we have added anywhere from a week to close to 3 weeks to the overall growing season. Again, that's based on an earlier last spring freeze and a later first fall freeze. Obviously, these are just averages, so things can change from year to year. Last year, for instance, the Raleigh area had their last spring freeze the first week of March. So in some cases, it's happened even earlier and led to an even longer growing season than this. Now, one caution I will give, especially in the springtime, is that, again, because these are just average dates, they don't account for the possibility of a false spring event. We've had one of those this year. It warmed up so early in late February and March that it felt like spring, and it seemed like there was no way we would get another freeze. But now that we're in late March and we've started to see a few cool mornings here and there, you start to believe, well, maybe we're not out of the woods of winter just yet. So I would say even though the growing season is becoming longer, that doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the added productivity of those extra week or two on either end of the growing season, because we do still have that threat of a false spring early on and then sort of that timely last freeze at this point in the season. So let's talk about what to expect over these next few months. These are the current 3-month outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. So look at the temperature outlook on the left. It is favoring mostly above normal temperatures across the majority of the country, and this is really a continuation of the pattern that we've been in so far in March. Of course, they've had some record high temperatures out west, but we have also been mostly warmer than normal here in the southeast. And it looks like that pattern will probably continue through the late spring and early summer. With the precipitation outlook, we do finally see a change from where we've been over the last few months. We've been in that dry spell for now almost 7 months, dating back to August. We've been waiting to get some better precipitation, and it looks like that may finally be coming by later in the spring and early in the summer. You see mid-Atlantic down through the southeast is favored for above normal precipitation over that time. I'll say that would be pretty much a carbon copy of last year. We were also dry coming out of last winter. Finally, by the time we got into May, we started seeing some better rainfall, and that continued on through June and July and the first part of August as well. So again, that's why I'm thinking maybe as we get into the summer, that'll give us some better rain chances and help us finally at least erode some of those drought conditions that we've got across the state. One of the other patterns that we're watching as we go into later this year is ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So I'm sure everybody has heard of El Nino and probably La Nina. That's basically what we're dealing with now. We have been in a La Nina pattern over the last couple winters. That means we've had cooler than normal water temperatures right along the equator in the Pacific. And it looks like we'll be shifting more to an El Nino type pattern, where there is warmer water in that same region. So if you look at these maps on these globes, you'll see this is obviously in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. North Carolina is almost half a world away. It's hard to even find our part of the country on this globe. So you may wonder, how on earth do these far-flung patterns actually affect our weather? And the answer is through the jet streams. So as we see this warming or cooling of the water in the Pacific, that can shift the strength and the position of the jet streams, especially during our cool season, during our fall and winter. The way I like to think about this is the jet stream is like being a piece of rope. So a weaker jet stream like we see in a La Nina event is like a very thin rope. And if you hold on to either end of that rope and push it together, it is very easy to make that rope bend and buckle and move all around. Well, that's what we tend to see from the jet stream in a La Nina winter like we just had. That jet stream can buckle and move to our north. That shifts the storm track to our north as well. So that's why some La Nina winters like this one, we just don't see as much precipitation. On the other hand, an El Nino jet stream is like a very strong, very thick piece of rope. No matter how hard you push either end of that rope, it is not going to buckle very easily. So that's what we tend to see in these El Nino winters. A very strong jet stream that's usually just to our south. It's picking up moisture off the Gulf, off the Atlantic. It's carrying storm systems through that same region, and that tends to bring wetter conditions in our part of the country. So that is one thing we'll watch for again later this year in the fall, maybe next winter, is probably shifting to an overall wetter than normal pattern. Another thing even sooner than that we can watch for is how that may affect tropical activity in the Atlantic this year. Again, because this is strengthening the winds in the jet stream that are happening in the upper levels of the atmosphere. Those strong upper level winds can rip apart developing tropical systems. We call that vertical wind shear when you have higher winds aloft than at the surface. So that means that as you get developing tropical storms and hurricanes, if they move into an area with high wind shear, they just don't develop as easily. In some cases, they can just get ripped apart. So we think even if the start of the season has pretty typical activity, by later on, maybe September, October of this year, we may see a reduction in tropical activity because of this developing El Nino pattern. So our last section here is focusing specifically on the summer and some of the impacts that you can watch for in your garden this year. And to start off, I wanted to talk about a weather trend that we've noticed, especially over the last 5 years or so. And at our office, we've started calling this weather whiplash because this describes this pattern of going back and forth between wet and dry with basically no warning at all. There's a great example I can give of this from Columbus County down in southeastern North Carolina. This was a couple years ago during the summer of 2024. If you remember that year, we got into a period of very hot, very dry weather in June through early July. Of course, that is a very critical time of the year for the corn crop, and it just wasn't getting the moisture that it needed. It was essentially getting roasted out in the fields by those hot temperatures, so the corn just never developed like it should. This picture shows what the corn looked like then. Typically, at this time of the year, it would be at least shoulder height. It was barely waist high at that point. So because of that drought in summer of 2024, that corn really struggled and never recovered. And yet just a couple months later, those same areas down in Columbus County were dealing with standing water and flooding on the roadways because we had suddenly flipped into a much wetter pattern by late July and early August. I'm sure all across the state, folks have noticed this happening, where it seems like we go from these wet spells to the dry ones much more quickly than we used to, and with much more severity on either end of that. We can also see that in projected changes for the future. The way I put this map is that when it rains, it pours. The wet days are getting even wetter. By the middle of the century, we will see a pretty substantial increase in the number of days where we're getting at least 3 inches of rainfall. And if you think about heavy rain in North Carolina, you probably think it's mostly the coastal areas that tend to see that, especially from tropical storms and hurricanes. But this map is showing the change in terms of a percentage. So it's actually inland areas that stand to see the biggest change. We may see a doubling of the number of days with at least 3 inches of rain in parts of the Triad, the Western Piedmont, getting into the Central Mountains. So that'll be the big shock to the system for these areas that are not used to seeing those heavy rain events. That will happen a lot more, and we've already started seeing some of those changes. The flip side of that is true as well. We will continue to see more of these flash drought events as we get into periods of hot and dry weather, especially during the spring and summer in our warm season. And you can see from this map, this is showing all across the world, areas that are at the greatest risk of flash drought development. Our part of the country in the eastern U.S. is one of the biggest hotspots there. And especially thinking about our climate in North Carolina, we are very reliant on moisture from the Gulf and off the Atlantic to help meet our average rainfall during the warm season. If we get into a pattern where instead the winds are coming from the west or from the northwest, then that cuts off the moisture supply, and we can see those rapidly developing flash drought events like we saw a couple summers ago. Another trend that we're watching and that you can watch for this year is warming summer nights. This is something that we've definitely seen in recent years, especially last July. The calendar here shows the nighttime lows in each day of July last year in the Raleigh area. So I've highlighted in red days where new daily record lows were set. That included Raleigh's all-time record low of 80 degrees, so it never dropped below 80 degrees that night in mid-July last year. But if you take a step back, you can see there were plenty of other days that month, even if they weren't records, where it never dropped below the mid-70s. That is very warm weather, and when you think about the humidity that we see at that time of the year, it is just very nasty, icky weather to be outdoors in. We see that these changes are also expected to continue into the future, especially across central and eastern North Carolina. We could add another 2 to 4 weeks during the year where we're never dropping below 75 degrees at night. Obviously, that affects people if you're outside at night or even early in the morning, but it also affects our pets and it affects our plants because we rely on having some cooler weather overnight at that time of the year to be able to cool off. Plants need that time to be able to respirate and breathe. So when we're just not seeing that cooling at that time of the year, that can add stress for everybody and everything that's outdoors. So Allison, I'll hand it back to you to wrap us up, leading with a look at invasive species.
All right, so plants like kudzu and Japanese honeysuckle are becoming more common, and that's likely because they're more adapted to this warm weather or less moisture that we're seeing. But it's not just invasives that we need to think about. We're also seeing an increase in a poison ivy production of the oil that causes all the issues is more prolific at higher CO2 concentrations. And so that's something that we expect to increase over time. So make sure leaves a 3, let it be. When it comes to pests, one of the emerging pests that has been newly identified is the allium leaf miner. And I know Matt Bertone and Debbie Roos have been doing some work on this, but the thing to keep in mind is this kind of curly leaf structure that you'll see. And Corey's going to help me out by dropping a link to some of the research that Debbie has done on this, Debbie and Matt have done on this. So you can check this out and learn a bit more. The other thing to keep in mind is fire ants. So fire ant quarantine view so far, more than 3/4 of the state now has fire ants. So this is something to keep in mind. These things are serious. I had fire ants actually chew through my internet connection line. That's how strong they were. So not a great thing to have to deal with. The other pest to bring to your attention is mosquitoes. As we warm, there is a greater likelihood that we'll have more days that are appropriate for mosquitoes so keep an eye out for those. Lots of issues can come from those beyond just the itchiness. So they do carry some diseases and things like that. So make sure to watch out for those standing water in your garden. Now, Corey mentioned those nighttime temperatures. So something that you may notice on your plants, if you have daytime temperatures above 90 degrees and nighttime temperatures above 70, tomato flower buds may look like this. They won't set fruit. They just die and fall off. You might also see yellow shoulders on your tomatoes. I know I've definitely seen this on a couple at the farmer's market, and this is because lycopene, which is responsible for that red color, ceases to form at temperatures over 85 degrees. Other impacts might be malformed fruit, and this is because we have more male flowers in warm temperatures, which leads to fewer fruit or fruit that's formed without complete pollination. And then lastly, thinking about taste and development of those plants. So carrots slow growth and are less sweet at temperatures warmer than 60 degrees, which is why they're generally tastier when they come from those cooler climates. So let's do a recap and share some resources. So in summary, there's lots of variety this winter. It was more than just the big snow that we saw. Drought has now been in place for 6 months with impacts likely to soil moisture and planting conditions. We expect a warm and potentially wetter spring and early summer. And we're shifting to El Nino, so look for those impacts later this year. Keep an eye out for weather whiplash and warm summer nights. If you want to stay up to speed on all the things we do at the Climate Office, be sure to subscribe to the Climate blog. Corey writes it. It's excellent. So if anything that he shared today you found valuable, definitely sign up for this because you're going to get the same type of quality information in the blog. We send it out about once a month. Corey also sends out the drought update. So it's also chock full of information. If you would like to be added to the email list for this, please send us your email. You can either drop it in the chat or you can send it to our email addresses, which are on the next slide. So reach out to us with any questions that you have via email, but we may have time, Charlotte, Ariyah, now for questions. Yeah?
Yeah, there's been a lot of questions in the chat. Would you like us to read them out, or have you been keeping track of them?
I have a couple, but we might need to tap on you for a couple of the ones that came through while I was speaking. One of the ones that jumped up to me, Corey, I wanted to bring up was the weather whiplash maps. So the drought and the precipitation. So someone said, these seem to contradict each other. Is this what you're trying to point out with the whiplash?
Let's see. We can go back to, is it these that they're talking about?
So.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit different in the way these are being measured. Again, this map on the left here is not necessarily here's the raw number of days with extreme precipitation totals that we'll see. This is the change from the historical number. So these coastal areas will still see a pretty big increase in those number of wet days, but because they already tend to get a lot of those, that registers as a lower change. These areas in western North Carolina, including the western Piedmont, they just don't see as many of those days historically. So those increases that they'll have going forward, they will stand out as a bigger percentage change in the future. So that's the main reason I highlighted those areas, just that, again, it will be a shock to the system to see those bigger increases in areas that haven't historically seen as many days like that.
Someone has asked if we could show the summary slide again. So I don't know if you want to leave it there, Corey.
Sure.
And I will dig up some more questions. And Charlotte, Ariyah, please feel free to jump in with any questions that you have noticed as well.
There was one question, which I do think you addressed somewhat, but how long these El Nino and La Nina patterns persist?
That's a great question. So usually we are rotating from an El Nino to a La Nina and sometimes through what we call a neutral state that's somewhere in between about every 2 to 3 years. But what's been interesting over the last 5 years is that we have had now 5 La Ninas over a 6-year span. So it is pretty unusual to be that consistently in one pattern. And that's also one reason why we've seen that prevalence of wintertime drought over that time. When we get in these La Nina patterns, it tends to be drier by the fall and especially through the winter time. So we'll keep the fingers crossed that this El Nino plays out and maybe we'll finally have a drought-free fall by the end of this year.
Hopefully that helped to answer the question about which one is better or worse, El Nino or La Nina.
Yeah, if you don't like drought, then you don't want to see a La Nina, but also we know in El Nino events, you can get those extreme rainfall events. Historically, we would think about El Ninos as being better suited for snow, but what we've noticed over the last decade or two is that during these El Nino patterns, when you get that warm weather to our south, when you get the jet stream that's pulling in those southerly air masses, it can often be too warm for snow during El Nino events. So even if we stand a better chance of seeing precipitation during El Nino winters, that does not mean it will be frozen precipitation. And I think that was evident this year. It's taken a couple La Nina years in a row to get some decent snow chances.
So another question that came up was, if these trends persist, would you expect commercial growers to change the types of crops they grow? And this came up in the Davidson Gardeners Conference that I presented at last week. I worked with Sam Boring, who's the horticulture specialist for Davidson County, and he shared some of the crops that had opportunities and some that would be moving out of range as things continue to progress. So he has some excellent resources there, but kind of the big takeaway is yes, I think that will be something that we'll see as these conditions change.
Yeah, Allison, that matches what I've heard as well. There may be cases where there's genetic varieties of different crops that are planted that are better suited to some of the future climate conditions. There may be opportunities for things like double growing seasons for some crops, but also we know that increases risks because if you encounter a drought or a heat wave at the wrong time of the year, then that could wipe away an entire season's worth of productivity.
All right, and we'll take one more if that's okay.
Sure.
All right, so this one's about land cover and land use change over time. So have we analyzed how changes in land cover in the state have affected temperatures and rainfall averages?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that sort of those warming winter nights, that was one of the first signs maybe 20 years ago that we were starting to feel those effects of climate change. Naturally, people will say, well, were those changes in urban areas? Were they in rural areas? The answer is really in both. When we look at those historical nighttime temperature changes over the last 50 to 100 years, we certainly see that those changes have happened in urban areas where we know there has been more development. We are now paving over what used to be a natural land. But we are also seeing some pretty significant changes in rural areas where it's still mostly farmland in undeveloped areas. So I think that there are definitely signs that, we have an urban heat island effect in North Carolina, but we also see those temperature trends happening in non-urban areas as well.
All right, and if you could switch it back to the climate blog page one last time, it looks like we've got quite a few people are asking for that. For those of you who put your email in the chat, I'm going to do my best to grab those and save them. But if you would like to sign up for the climate blog, you can do it really easily yourself here by scanning the QR code or typing in the address in your browser.
And we'll also make sure to send that link and the others you've shared out with our recording and follow-up resources.
Well, thank you all so much. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. Charlotte, Ariyah, did you have anything you wanted to raise with us?
Just thank you for a truly excellent presentation that's really helped bring a lot of clarity, hopefully, to what we can anticipate. I'm really holding out for that rain to return this summer, to have some wetter weather and potentially less intense hurricane season would be great as well. So thank you so much for joining us today and doing such an excellent job sharing what can be really complicated and sometimes controversial information. We appreciate the work you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to turn it over to Matt and Mike for our BOLOs.
All
Great.
right. Good morning, everybody. Matt, are you going first? You were first on a program.
Sure, I'll go first. And that was a really great presentation. I can't wait to watch it again, actually, and just see all the graphs and all that stuff and everything. So thank you for presenting on that. All righty, let's talk about some BOLOs for arthropods, for the critters out there. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. And yeah, so I'm actually seeing a lot of these things already. I was just talking to Mike this morning that, we can't cover everything, everything that's out there, going to be out there. And also different regions of the state, as we just heard, have very different climates and different times of activity. So you may be seeing all these things. These may be old news to some of you out there, but these may be some things that you're going to be starting to see brand new. And so a few things that you'll be on the lookout for. I'm sure many of you have already started to see the carpenter bees out and about. The males have these yellow faces. They're going to guard territories. They buzz around aggressively and look scary, but they're completely harmless. And they're basically guarding carpenter bees overwinters adults in the tunnels. They emerge very quickly in the spring to start making new nests for their young. And they are important pollinators, although they are a nuisance to people when they bore into the homes and into wooden structures around people's yards. But other things, I'm starting to see paper wasps and other hornets and relatives of paper wasps, the hornets and yellow jackets, becoming active. I've seen a few queens of yellow jackets around, and you'll start seeing these paper wasps creating their paper nests up in the eaves of homes. And then we have one under our porch right now starting. In fact, there's two of them in the nest. And as the boxwoods start to leaf out, you're going to have these tender boxwood leaves. You may notice little orange gnat-like insects flying around. Those are the boxwood leaf miners that are laying the eggs in the new leaves. The eggs they lay will hatch into little maggots, little orange or yellow maggots that live inside the leaf throughout the rest of the year. The adults will die out soon after they mate and reproduce and lay the eggs, and you won't see them again until next year when they emerge again. You may have some home invaders this spring as it starts to warm up. We've had a couple instances in the past of Hoplia monkey beetles coming into homes. We've had a story of them swarming around people's chimneys. They like to find spots, kind of notable locations that they all find attractive to kind of swarm and mate together, but they will sometimes invade trees. And you can identify this beetle by the single claw on the hind foot and the hind tarsus. You may also see little tiny crawling critters around your home or coming into the home. These little flat mites with these little scaly bodies and kind of greenish red with these very long front legs. Those are clover mites, and they're usually active in the cooler parts of the year, and then you won't see their activity during summer. They are harmless to humans. They are plant feeders. They are technically a relative or a spider mite, technically. So just be aware that if you see these little tiny things crawling around, sometimes people smash them and they see like a red mess, and that's actually their blood, not your blood. These aren't biting humans or pets or anything like that. But of course, if you're, with any of these creatures that we talk about, if you're curious about what they are, you want a real ID, you're not able to figure it out, please always feel free to submit some images through the clinic and we will take a look. Of course, all the little babies that overwintered as eggs inside their eggs are starting to hatch. So the baby praying mantises are going to start to be out and about. You're going to have baby leaf-footed bugs and baby assassin bugs. The leaf-footed bugs starting to feed on some of the plants out there. Although they're typically not a huge pest, they can be a nuisance or can feed on some of the plants out there. But luckily, at this time of year, you're not going to have a lot of the fruit and things like that you'd want to protect from the leaf-footed bugs. The assassin bugs, like the wheel bugs, look very similar. They're going to be black on the front half with these larger front legs, whereas the leaf-footed bugs have much larger hind legs. And you may even see them hatching from their egg masses, each of these groups. Caterpillars are starting to be out and about, but starting to become active. Some of them are actually very active right when the buds start to break. The leaves start to grow out, start to expand. In fact, at my sister's house in Cary, I saw a very new little eastern tent caterpillar mass on one of the wild cherry trees there. The caterpillars were still small, but then they start to grow, get about almost 2 inches long, fairly large caterpillars. Not super destructive, often found in cherries and apples, but you may also see fall cankerworms, which are an inchworm type caterpillar, these little green ones, and lots of other caterpillars, either some that are overwintering and waking up and starting to continue feeding, or those that overwintered as eggs, like the fall cankerworms and the tent caterpillars. If you're digging your soil, you're starting to get all excited about gardening, you're going to start to dig, you might find white grubs. Now, I should mention that if you find one or two here or there, it's not an issue. They're kind of detritivores. They're feeding on that kind of that rotting vegetable matter under the ground. If you're finding a whole bunch of them, then, maybe try and figure out the ID. You may try to remove them from the environment, but generally they're beneficial, but some species can feed on grass roots and things like that and plant roots. So if you want to ID them, again, feel free to submit them to the clinic or take good photos, especially of the rump. The rear is very important for identifying them. And also, you may be seeing on their plants scales, either mating, and then the crawlers might be coming out soon. So certain species, like these soft scales here, you got this fly-like male that mates with this female that's sedentary, and she will produce young that will crawl and infest the rest of the plant, continuing the life cycle. You will also start to see termites swarming, cockroaches kind of becoming more active, like the palmetto bugs here. So the black and white one is the nymph, and the older one, the more mature one, is this dark brownish red, almost black color. Slugs, spiders, lots of other critters are becoming active. Everything's starting to wake up. As the plants wake up, all these other critters are starting to become more active. So far too many for me to mention, but of course, if you're out there in your garden, you're going to start to see more critters around. And just know that not all of them, actually the majority of them, are not pests, but it's always good to, if you're curious, figure out what the identification is of those. And if you need help, as always, we're here to help you identify them. And finally, I just want to make mention, last month I mentioned about the yellow-legged hornets. Definitely still be on the lookout for them and their new nests. We are on the lookout for them, especially maybe around the Charlotte area, but other areas of the state. So go back to that recording if you want to learn more information about them and some other, and box tree moth. But another thing, of course, we always have to mention is the spotted lanternflies. This is the time of year when they're going to start to hatch from their egg masses. The egg masses are what's the overwintering stage. You get these little tiny domino-like insects, sometimes in big groups, these black insects with little white spots all over them. Please let us know if you're finding them. This is especially true if you see the distribution. Currently in North Carolina, they are established in Davidson, Rowan, Caswell, Forsyth, Guilford, Caldwell, and Rockingham counties. And so if you find these outside of the counties, please let us or the North Carolina Department of Agriculture know. The Department of Ag has a special site to report spotted lanternflies, but these, we do know that they're in these counties, but if you see them outside the county, we would love to know to make sure we record and possibly can try to manage them. Not we, but the Department of Ag. And with
Just Matt, a recap maybe for those who missed the earlier talks about this. What is the concern with spotted lanternfly?
Yes, so spotted lanternfly, they feed on a number of different plants, although the direct effects on a lot of the plants is not very well established, and we don't really consider them a huge risk to those plants. Grapes are the exception. We've found that people who study grapes show that they can cause mortality of grapes and concern. I think the biggest concern is going to be the nuisance issue. So they're going to be flying around. They feed on lots of plants. They produce a lot of honeydew, sooty mold. They get into homes. They get into buildings and businesses. They're very beautiful insects, but they are large and very abundant where they become established. And there's plenty of information out there about them. If you haven't heard of spotted lanternfly, I'm very surprised because it's a very hot topic. But please let us know if you have any more questions, and I'll stop sharing to let Mike do his bolos, and I will answer some of these questions in the chat.
All right. So yeah, wow, what a presentation, a couple of presentations here today. Let me start out by kind of tag teaming with the idea of our weather impacts. And this is a sample that came in as an image only sample, technically insufficient to diagnose for sure, but it just came in yesterday, some dwarf Yopon hollies from a landscape in Wake County. And one of the things that is suspicious here is that this may be something called winter injury. And that is the combination of either frozen soils or low moisture soils with cold, dry winds or possibly sun exposure, where you get a sort of desiccation, especially of our broadleaf evergreen plants. So I noted that a couple of people mentioned in the chat their memories of the winter where the need to water more. So where that didn't happen and where the soils were dry, some of the things that we may be seeing going into spring would be related to possibly this kind of winter injury. What I would encourage people to do in this situation is look and see, is the cambium still alive? Are the buds still alive? And see how they break bud later. Also, let me mention that the whole whiplash, climate whiplash would be a concern possibly for plants if we get a lot of heavy rains at one time of year that encourage root rot diseases, and then it dries off after that, and then the plants are under extra stress because they don't have the root systems necessary to help supply their needs when the time of heat and drought comes. So there's some things to watch for there. And also there are some of our plant diseases that are more problematic when trees have been subjected to drought. So armillaria, root rot would be one, Biskinosia canker would be another. So there's some possible effects of all the weather woes that we've been seeing on our plants going into the rest of the year here. So those are things to kind of in general be keeping an eye out for. Another sample that came in not too long ago was this boxwood from a home landscape in Person County, and Ashley worked it up. There was no disease that could be found except in the soil. When we forwarded the roots to the North Carolina Department of Agriculture Consumer Services Nematode Assay Laboratory, they found very high levels of spiral nematode. There were also some lesion nematodes there. So it could be a combination here of the weather and the fact that roots were being affected by nematodes. One other interesting recent sample, a kind of a combo insect fungus situation would be the sooty mold. So this was on a gardenia sample that Mart Bumgardner submitted, and this gardenia was really hammered with citrus whitefly, and the honeydew from those whiteflies will tend to promote the growth of sooty molds. So it's not a plant pest directly and isn't going to really cause problems unless it were so heavy that you were actually interfering with sunlight reaching the interior of the leaf. Our diagnosis for sooty mold would be rub it with your thumb, and if it comes off easily and you see the green underneath, then that's what you had. And look for insects either on that particular plant or on the overstory trees. I did this question last year and I'm going to do it again. I need to launch a poll here. So if we do get some good warm rains in the month of April, the galls on our junipers are going to start producing these gelatinous teleohorns, we call them, on which the basidia spores of a particular fungus will form. And where is that going to be a possible risk for? Will it be for other junipers in the landscape? I'm sorry, first question, for apple trees, for other junipers in the landscape, for oaks, or for pines? And it looks like pretty much people have a good handle on this. I'll end the poll now and share the results that yes, 2/3 are correct, that this will be something that would infect, in fact, our apple trees. And we'll see the symptoms of those start showing up and then about a month later in May. So this is, if you weren't familiar with it, this is cedar apple rust, the teleoform on the juniper hosts. So something to be on the lookout for coming up. All right, a few other things to be on the lookout for in our, starting out with some of our ornamentals. Rose rosette on rose, and you can see some of the symptoms there. Some of the early symptoms would be elongation of the shoots and the retention of a juvenile red color when it should disappear over time. And later in the season, we'll start seeing the things like witch's broom and the deformed flower petals and so on. So keep an eye out for rose rosette on roses, as well as black spot and Cercospora, quote unquote Cercospora leaf spot. Shot hole on cherry laurel, a couple possible causes of shot hole out there in our prunus species, but this is not an insect that's been feeding on it. And you can tell because you can see some of the spots that are necrotic, they're dead, and they just haven't dropped out yet. And when they drop out, it does form these holes in the leaves. A few more ornamental, be on the lookouts, Entomosporium leaf spot on Photinia and on Indian hawthorn here in the upper left that is to be seen. Spot anthracnose of dogwood, probably dependent on how much precipitation we get, whether we'll see much of it. Seems like the last year or two we have not seen that much. On the bracts here, this is not to be confused with dogwood anthracnose, which is a more serious canker type disease, but you wouldn't expect to see that outside of the mountains. And we really haven't seen that in the clinic here for quite a while. Spot anthracnose, though, is something to be on the lookout for. Exobasidium leaf gall of camellias. Now, this is interesting because the spores would have been produced last spring and just hiding out in the buds of the camellias that when they start growth, they form these waxy sort of thick leaves, these galls that on the underside, you get the sporulation that occurs. So be vigilant on this and get them picked off before they have a chance to produce spores and then continue their life cycle. Boxwood blight and boxwood dieback, also be on the lookout for those, and iris leaf spot, as you see in the lower left here. Turning to our fruits, which is going to be the feature of next month's PP&P. On peaches, you may see peach leaf curl, shown there on the left, and in the lower left, that is the twig phase of brown rot on peach. So that disease, that fungus causes a blossom and twig phase early and then the fruit rot later in the year. And fire blight on pear could start showing up also this month, pear being the most susceptible of our susceptible hosts. So start being on the lookout for that in April, although that photograph came actually from September of last year, interestingly enough. Couple more on fruit. On blackberry, you may be seeing cane blight. You may be seeing some of the rust diseases, such as the one pictured there is cane and leaf rust. There's another one, orange rust, that causes more of a waxy orange type of pustule and is actually systemic. So if you have that one, it's more serious than you have this one here. And herbicide injury. So the herbicides are being started to be applied, and even things that may have occurred last year could affect this year. So this blueberry here on the left, that was a case where it was suspected that a glyphosate exposure the previous year had caused problems when leaf out occurred. And another example of suspected glyphosate injury was on these raspberries. This is from several years ago. You notice the nice clear zone at the foot of this planting, and you'll notice that the leaves here coming out are chlorotic, interveinal chlorosis, some deformation, maybe some shoot proliferation there. And this was a suspected case where some glyphosate had been applied and absorbed by the roots, which is not usually a route that we think of for glyphosate. Again, I am not a turf person, but what the turf people tell me is that these are some things to be on the lookout for. And I was actually looking at our data, and by far the biggest actual turf disease that we see in our North Carolina lawns in April is large patch. So this is a case where the warm season grasses are under stress from the cool weather and they tend to show the disease. But you could be on the lookout for these others as well, such as spring dead spot and fairy ring. I should, though, emphasize that most of our problems in North Carolina lawns are abiotic, so not from pests or pathogens, rather from the environmental factors. And Lee Butler gave me this list a while back, and things to be aware of are the effect of shade on our turf grasses, drainage, improper mowing height or frequency, inadequate fertilization, and this problem that we have in North Carolina of not really being in a good zone for either the warm or the cool season grasses, especially here in the center part of the state. So take your pick and you will have chosen something that isn't completely adapted here. And as a final reminder, you can see this is how it looks on our new website. We do have all the Be on the Lookout lists month by month available. And if you want to scan a QR code and pull that up, you'll have that available as well. And there are a few maybe formatting issues that we still have to take care of after the website transition. I did clean up April's though, so it's ready to go, and have a look for more Be on the Lookouts. All right, I have not been paying attention to the chat during all that, but it looks like what can be sprayed on apple trees to prevent the cedar apple rust? There is a publication, we can find it and put it in the list, but there's a publication that is on your basic spray program for the home orchard, and that's going to be a subject that we're going to touch on actually soon in the next PMP, but by then you want to have, of course, your program in place if you are going to spray. So let us get back to you on that particular question. And it looks like that's all the questions that were directed at me. So back to Ariyah and Charlotte.
All right. I really like the comment. I love the Matt and Mike show. I think maybe we need to change BOLOs to the Matt and Mike show. So we appreciate you guys and all the wonderful information you share. We'll finish out today's webinar with Plant These for Pollinators and a few announcements. This is our ongoing segment where we feature a great plant that supports pollinator populations, is something that's commercially available. And just a reminder that you'll want to have something in bloom in your yard all throughout the growing season. Early spring and late fall are especially important because there's less around. So those are times of the year you really want to make sure you've got things in bloom to support pollinators. And all of the slides from the Plant These for Pollinators segment are available for your use in extension programming in our slide archive. So today we're going to feature Serviceberry. This is a whole group of native trees and shrubs in the Amelanchier genus. So there are different species that occur all across North America, and we have several species here in North Carolina. Some of the more prominent ones would be Amelanchier arborea, sometimes known as downy serviceberry because the leaves have little hairs on them. And it can be found through most of North Carolina. It's what's pictured here, although it's not quite as common in the outer coastal plain. But in eastern North Carolina, there are actually several species, which include Amelanchier canadensis, sometimes known as the eastern serviceberry, and Amelanchier obavalis, the coastal serviceberry. A lot of these, I should say, look very similar, and telling them apart can be quite challenging, especially if you don't have blossoms and know where they're growing and have, idea of the overall habit of growth. And so they can be very similar looking plants across the whole genus. And then in western North Carolina, we have Amelanchier laevis, sometimes called the smooth serviceberry because it doesn't have hairs on the leaves, and also sometimes called the Allegheny serviceberry. So there's a lot of different species, and there's a lot of common names. We're going to mention just a few of the other common names on the coming slides. So in the wild, though, I should mention this is an understory tree, and you'll often find it at the edge of the woods or in kind of more open woodland areas where it can get some dappled sunlight. And it is currently blooming, particularly more in the western part, moving across the western part of the state. I suspect in the eastern part of the state, it's probably finished blooming. Here in the Piedmont, it's finished blooming over the weekend. That 85-degree day kind of finished off the blooms here, for at least at my house. So the flowers, as you can see, are small white flowers. They're in clusters. They open in early spring, so usually mid to late March through early April. And one of the common names is shadbush or shadblow, especially in the coastal plain area in the East Coast. And that's because they tend to bloom at the time of the year when the shad run upstream to spawn. So that leads to one of the common names that you'll see listed for serviceberry. The blooms do tend to open just as the leaves emerge or just before, so you do get the whole plant covered in white and otherwise rather bare looking. And as I mentioned, very warm and windy spring weather can come out, bloom, and be done in a week. So in a gentler spring where it's not so crazy up and down, you might have blooms for a couple of weeks. maybe 3 at the very most, but in our really up and down springs, they can come and go pretty quickly. And if you were to look closely at the flowers and then think about some of the blossoms of things like apple trees and pear trees, plums, even blackberry, you'll see a resemblance. And that's because these are in the rose family, which many of those fruits are. And these are just some pictures, I believe, of Serratina bees. And Matt, please correct me if I've got them wrong, but these are some of our native bees. This past weekend, the ambulantria I have was covered in pollinators. A lot of them were very small. There were some hoverflies in addition to many different types of bees. They were very hard to take pictures of because they move so quickly, but I was able to get these guys. Like other members of the rose family, they do have fruit, and this is among some of our earliest native trees to bear an edible fruit, and that leads to the common name Juneberry. Actually, here in North Carolina, they will often be ripening in May, but maybe more in the western part of the state. And these ambulantria species do occur right up through New England and into Canada. So in more northern areas, they are more likely to be ripening in June. And the fruits they look a little bit like blueberries, like wild. They're similar in size to wild blueberries. They're not quite as large as, say, your cultivated blueberries. And they will start off green and then turn pink and then ripen to this kind of purpley black color. They are very tasty. I've only had them a few times because the birds get them so quickly. The birds love them. It is challenging to grow them for fruit production because so many other things out there are wanting to eat them. But to me, they taste like a cross between blueberry and cherry. The fruit and the plants in general are also susceptible to cedar quince rust, and that's what you see in this lower picture where the fruits very kind of a related rust disease to what Mike was sharing with the cedar apple rust. So it infects the fruits and they get these really bizarre looking orange growths coming out of the fruit. And of course, those would not be edible. And the leaves themselves are eaten by caterpillars. So the plant is a host for several species of moth caterpillars. And of course, the caterpillars then become essential bird food and feed other organisms all throughout the food chain. So it's a wonderful plant for wildlife and for supporting ecosystems and pollinators. It's also a nice landscape tree. It tends to grow usually more upright, but they can be quite widespreading, almost always multi-stemmed unless they're particularly trained to be a single stem. It does prefer woodland conditions, as that's where it naturally occurs, but it'll grow very well in sun to park shade, in moist and well-drained soil. It does like those woodsy kind of soils where you have some organic matter, they're slightly acidic. It blooms generally at the same time as redbud and can make a really nice companion to redbud to see the white and purple together. And as you can see in this picture, it's a nice alternative to Bradford pear. Bradford pear might bloom just a little bit earlier typically, but this kind of gives you a similar look, maybe not quite so formal looking because it does have more multiple stems, but similar white, just kind of covered in those white flowers in early spring. And like Bradford pear, it also has excellent fall color. So this is a picture of the same tree here in spring and here in fall. And the fall color can vary with cultivars and a little bit from season to season, but it tends to be yellow, orange, and this rusty red, like you see here, would be really typical for serviceberries or amelanchier growing in sunnier sites. There are quite a few commercially available varieties and species. So usually when you are looking for them, and I should mention that there's also a lot of confusion among them since they are hard to tell apart in the nursery trade as well. So, some things may be labeled as Amelanchier arborea or Canadensis or Laevis. And, one, they may like Laevis, it might be arborea. So there is some confusion out there. And then these do readily cross with each other in the wild and in cultivation. So there are quite a few hybrids, some naturally occurring, some kind of human created or human assisted, I should say. But with the bees visiting them and the bloom times overlapping, they just very easily naturally produce hybrids. So you'll see Amelanchier grandiflora or Amelanchier lamarckii. In fact, in nursery trade, those are probably most likely what you're going to find. Those tend to have larger flowers than the species and more reliable fall color. So there's just, certain traits people have selected these hybrids for that make them more attractive as landscape plants. And you'll see different named cultivars of those hybrids like Autumn Brilliance and Autumn Sunset, Ballerina, and Princess Diana. are some that are available and recommended for southern landscapes particularly. And you can learn a lot more about Amelanchier and the different species and see lots of images by going to the Plant Toolbox. And the Plant Toolbox is also a great place to learn about and select plants for your landscape. And you can drill down to get specific conditions, both in your growing and your site conditions, as well as what you are looking for in the plant. So encourage you to check it out. And we are going to wrap up now with just a few announcements to finish off our plants, pests, and pathogens for March. Of course, as Ariyah opened us with some opening announcements, just a reminder that tomorrow is our special day of giving webinar where we will be learning more about trees for bees. Basically, it'll be woody plants for bees, so it'll be trees and shrubs that support native pollinators and honeybees. So I encourage you to join us. If you're not able to join the live webinar, it will be recorded. We will be sending the recording out. And then, of course, again, tomorrow is Day of Giving. So we encourage, if you are interested in making a gift to the program, to do that tomorrow, because it will help meet our 2 challenge gifts. And we appreciate everything you do to support the program. And another way you can help out is just spread the word. We have some posts on our statewide Extension Master Gardener Facebook page about Day of Giving. So if you are able to share those posts on your local EMG Facebook page or personal Facebook page, you can help it that way by just spreading the word to others. And some other recent continuing education, we offered the Learn, Grow, Share Showcase back in February on growing youth education with 4-H. If you missed that, it was an excellent presentation. We heard from volunteers and extension professionals in Wake and Lenore County about the work they're doing in partnership with 4-H for youth education. And that's posted on the North Carolina EMG intranet. We have some upcoming continuing education opportunities in April. On April 10th, we will be learning about engaging young children with hands-on learning. So we're kind of continuing the theme of working with kids. This is going to be a webinar both for Extension Master Gardener volunteers and Extension Master Food volunteers. We will be hearing from Kyle Hood, who works with the Garden, he's the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate with NC State. And it'll be talking about not only growing the vegetables. Actually, growing the vegetables won't so much be the focus. We'll be talking about using those experiences to support learning and engaging young children, particularly in learning. Then on April 16th, we have another great webinar with Bethany Greiger, who is the web resource specialist with Extension IT, and she will be sharing with us everything we need to know about digital accessibility requirements. These are some new requirements that are coming in place for all state and local governments, including all public universities from the federal government, and they will help us make sure that all of our digital resources are fully accessible to the people across our state and beyond. I encourage you to join us for that webinar as well, especially if you are working on social media, newsletters, webinar, anything online, any type of online education for the Extension Master Gardener program. This will be a really essential webinar for you to participate in. And of course, it'll be recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording as well. Then please save the date. Also in April, the later part of April, we will be opening registration for Extension Master Gardener College. This year, it'll be a little bit different. We will be doing something that many of you have asked for some time, which is, instead of having this concentrated multi-day conference on campus in Raleigh, we'll be moving out and doing part of the conference as online webinars that you will participate in before an in-person workshop, a one-day in-person workshop. So you'll have the opportunity to either attend those webinars live or watch the recordings, and those will be preparation for our workshop, which we will hold twice, once in Greenville, so for those in the eastern part of the state, and once in Stateville, if you're more in the western part of the state. Hopefully we can make it more accessible to everybody. So we will have lots more information, and again, registration coming out in April. And if you really want to dig deep, of course, I should have mentioned our EMG College theme is Become a Pollinator Ambassador. So all of the webinars and the in-person activities will be helping you to learn more about protecting pollinators and how you can teach others how to protect pollinators. But if you really want to dig deep in pollinator identification and learning about the pollinators that are out there and the work they're doing, you have a wonderful opportunity with the Great Southeast Pollinator course. This is being offered by the University of Georgia Extension, and as you can see, it is an in-depth course where there will be 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Each week will dig deep into a group of pollinators. It does align with the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, so that is how the classes are organized by the categories that if you participate in the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, these are the categories that you report pollinator activity under. And mentioning the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, I hope you have it marked on your calendar. It'll be August 21st and 22nd this year. As always, Amanda Bratcher is our state coordinator for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina. And she's got lots of great information and resources posted online at go.ncsu.edu/GSEPCINNC. And of course, that'll be one of the links that goes out in our follow-up resources. But Amanda has set some really admirable goals for us this year, which we hope to reach and all be part of, reporting at least 10,000 pollinator counts and having activity in all 100 counties. I believe last year there were counts submitted from 92 counties, so we're almost there. We hope to get all 100 counties engaged this year. And we will wrap it up there and just say next month, I'm really looking forward to seeing you again and really looking forward to Matt and Mike's feature presentation on fruit tree success in residential landscapes. We'll be back on the fourth Tuesday, which will be April 28th, 10 o'clock to 11:30. And we look forward to seeing you then. Hopefully we won't see too many 90-degree days between now and then, but I'm afraid that might be the case. But either way, we'll be here and we'll be looking forward to see you. Thank you.
Yep,
Thank you to all our speakers today.
have a great month, everybody.
Thanks everyone for attending.